Most people imagine a prison as something visible: steel bars, locked doors, concrete walls, place where freedom has been taken away by force. But the most dangerous prison rarely looks like this. It has no walls that others can see. No chains around the body. No locked gate preventing escape. Instead, it exists quietly within the mind. And because it is invisible, most people never realize they are living inside it. This is what makes it so powerful. A person can travel the world, build a successful career, form relationships, and appear completely free. Yet inwardly, every decision is still being guided by fears they never questioned, beliefs they never chose, emotional memories they never understood. The prison is not physical. It is psychological. It is built one experience at a time. Painful rejection becomes the belief, I am not enough. A betrayal becomes, no one can be trusted. A childhood filled with criticism becomes, perfection is the only way to be accepted. These conclusions rarely feel like opinions. They feel like reality. Over time, the mind stops recognizing them as interpretations. It begins treating them as facts. This is how unconscious patterns are, formed not through dramatic moments alone, but through countless small experiences that quietly shape the way a person sees themselves. And the world. The strange thing is that the mind prefers familiarity over freedom. Even painful beliefs can feel safer than uncertainty. A person may remain inside emotional patterns that create suffering simply because those patterns have become predictable. The unknown feels more dangerous than the familiar prison. This is why people often repeat the same relationships, the same fears, the same disappointments, the same inner conversations, not because they consciously choose suffering, but because the unconscious chooses what it already knows. And every repetition quietly strengthens the walls. The greatest illusion is that these walls are made by the outside world. People blame circumstances. Other people, bad luck. The past. Yet much of what limits them now is no longer happening around them. It is happening within them. The past survives because the mind continues carrying it into the present. This is why psychological imprisonment is so difficult to recognize. The prisoner and the prison appear to be the same. The thoughts feel personal. The fears feel logical. The limitations feel permanent. Until one simple but unsettling question appears. What if the life I believe I must live is only the life my unconscious learned to expect? Because the strongest prison is never the one that locks the body. It is the one that convinces the mind it was never free to begin with. As a person begins to recognize that the mind can quietly become its own prison, another unsettling question naturally follows. Who built the walls? Most people assume they created their own identity through conscious choice. They believe their personality simply reflects who they are, their habits, their preferences. Their strengths, their weaknesses. But much of what people call their identity was never freely chosen. It was slowly constructed through adaptation. From the earliest years of life, the mind begins observing the world with one purpose above all others: to remain safe, to remain accepted. To belong. A child quickly discovers that certain emotions are welcomed while others create discomfort. Curiosity may be ignored. Anger may be punished. Fear may be mocked. Sensitivity may be mistaken for weakness. Without fully understanding what is happening, the mind begins making silent adjustments. Be quieter. Be stronger. Don't disappoint. Don't need too much. Never let them see you struggle. These are not conscious decisions. They are survival strategies. And at first, they serve an important purpose. They protect the developing self from rejection, conflict, and emotional pain. But the unconscious does not always know when protection is no longer necessary. The strategies that once preserved the child quietly become the identity of the adult. The person who learned to hide sadness becomes emotionally distant. The one who survived through perfection becomes unable to rest. The one who believed love had to be earned spends a lifetime chasing approval. The prison grows stronger, not because new walls are built, but because old ones are never questioned. This is why change often feels so. The IFFICULTA person is not simply changing a habit. They are challenging the very structure that once made them feel psychologically safe. The unconscious interprets this as danger. It whispers, "Stay the same. Don't risk rejection. Don't become someone unfamiliar." And so people remain loyal to identities that no longer allow them to live fully. Not because those identities are true, but because they are familiar. The greatest tragedy is that many people spend their lives protecting a version of themselves that was created only to survive. They mistake adaptation for authenticity, performance for identity, safety for freedom. Yet the walls begin to weaken the moment a person asks a different question. Not, "Who am I expected to be?" but, "Who was I before fear taught me who I had to become?" Because the identity that once kept you safe may now be the very prison keeping you from yourself. As the hidden structure of identity begins to reveal itself, another truth quietly comes into view. Not every thought that enters your mind belongs to the present. Most people trust their thoughts without hesitation. If the mind says, "You will fail," they prepare for failure. If it whispers, "You are not enough," they accept it as fact. If it insists, "No one truly understands you," they begin seeing evidence of it everywhere. Rarely does a person stop to ask a more important question. Where did this thought come from? Because the mind is not only shaped by what is happening now, it is shaped by what once happened and was never fully understood. The unconscious has a remarkable way of carrying old emotional experiences into new situations. A single painful memory can quietly become the lens through which countless future experiences are interpreted. Someone who grew up feeling constantly criticized may hear judgment where none exists. A person who once experienced betrayal may struggle to trust genuine kindness. Another who repeatedly felt ignored may mistake silence for rejection. The present moment becomes filtered through the emotional memory of the past. This is how invisible prisons continue strengthening themselves, not by creating new suffering, but by convincing the mind that yesterday's pain is today's reality. The strange part is that these thoughts feel logical, reasonable, not even obvious. Because the unconscious does not announce itself, it speaks in the voice of certainty. It says, "This is simply the way things are." Over time, people stop questioning these inner conversations. They build entire lives around them, avoid opportunities because they expect failure, hide emotions because they expect rejection, remain silent because they expect misunderstanding. The thought becomes a belief. The belief becomes a habit. The habit becomes a personality. And eventually, the prison feels indistinguishable from the self. This is why changing thoughts alone is rarely enough. The deeper question is not, "What am I thinking?" It is, "What emotional experience taught my mind to think this way?" Because every recurring thought carries a history. Every persistent fear has a beginning. Every limiting belief was once an attempt to make sense of pain. And until that hidden origin becomes visible, the mind continues confusing memory with reality. Sometimes, the loudest voice in your head is not speaking from the present at all. It is an old wound that never realized time had passed. As a person begins to recognize that many thoughts are echoes of old wounds rather than reflections of present reality, another question quietly begins to emerge. If these thoughts are not the prison itself, then what keeps the prison standing? The answer is rarely a single belief. It is the story beneath the belief every human mind quietly constructs. Narratives about the world. Stories about love. Stories about safety. Stories about failure. Stories about Worth. Stories about what must happen in order to belong. At first, these stories seem harmless. They help the mind organize experience. They reduce uncertainty. They explain pain. But explanations have a hidden danger. When they remain unquestioned for too long, they stop feeling like stories. They begin feeling like reality. A person who repeatedly experienced rejection may create a silent conclusion. I am difficult to love. Someone who is praised only for achievement may begin believing, my value depends on what I accomplish. Another who learned that vulnerability led to disappointment quietly decides, if I never open myself completely, I can never be hurt completely. These conclusions become invisible rules, not because they are true, but because they have been repeated for years. From that moment onward, life is no longer experienced directly. It is interpreted. Every new relationship passes through the story. Every opportunity passes through the story. Every failure confirms the story. Even success is often explained in ways that protect it. The mind begins collecting evidence, ignoring anything that contradicts the narrative, remembering everything that supports it. Without realizing it, the person becomes both the author and the prisoner of the same psychological story. This is why two people can experience the same event and leave with completely different meanings. The event is shared. The story is not. And the unconscious protects familiar stories because they create certainty. Even painful certainty often feels safer than uncertain freedom. To question the story is to question the identity built around it, and that can feel like losing the ground beneath your feet. Yet this is where genuine freedom quietly begins. Not by forcing positive beliefs, not by denying difficult experiences, but by asking one simple question whenever the mind insists it already knows the truth. Is this reality or is this the story I have repeated until it became reality? Because every invisible prison is held together by a story that has never been questioned. And sometimes the strongest walls are made not of fear, but of certainty. After recognizing that invisible prisons are built from hidden stories rather than visible walls, another realization quietly begins to emerge. The greatest obstacle to freedom is not fear alone. It is certainty. Most people imagine certainty as strength. To know exactly who they are. To know exactly how the world works. To know what people think of them. To know what is possible and what is not. This confidence appears reassuring. It creates order. Predictability. Control. But the unconscious often hides itself inside certainty. Because the moment a belief no longer feels like a belief, it becomes impossible to question. The person no longer says, I believe I am unworthy. They simply say, I know. They no longer think, I might be afraid of rejection. They conclude, people always leave. These statements feel absolute. Final. Beyond discussion. Yet every certainty about the self was once created by experience. And experience is never the whole of reality. The mind prefers certainty because uncertainty requires awareness. Awareness forces a person to remain present. To observe instead of immediately judging. To question instead of automatically reacting. This feels uncomfortable because questioning the familiar means risking the collapse of an identity that has existed for years. The unconscious quietly resists this process, not because it wants suffering, but because it equates the familiar with safety. This is why many people remain loyal to painful beliefs, not because those beliefs are true, but because they are predictable. The prison becomes comfortable. Its walls become recognizable. Its limits become part of daily life. And slowly, the person forgets there was ever another way of seeing. True psychological freedom does not begin when every answer is found. It begins when certainty becomes less important than understanding. When the mind becomes willing to ask, what if I have mistaken protection for truth? That single question creates a small opening. Through that opening, Awareness enters. The old beliefs do not disappear immediately. The fears do not vanish overnight. But something essential changes. For the first time, the person realizes they are observing the prison instead of unconsciously living inside it. And once the observer awakens, the walls begin losing their authority. Because freedom does not arrive when the mind knows everything. It arrives when the mind becomes humble enough to question what it has always believed. Sometimes the first step out of the prison is doubting the voice that convinced you it was the only world that existed. After recognizing that the mind can become a prison, that identity may be built from survival, that old wounds shape present thoughts, that hidden stories quietly control perception, and that certainty often strengthens invisible walls, one final truth remains. The door was never locked, it was only unseen. This is perhaps the most unsettling realization of all. For years, a person may believe they have been trapped by circumstances. By the past, by other people, by childhood, by failure, by fear. And while all of these experiences leave real psychological marks, they do not always remain the prison. More often, the prison survives because the mind continues identifying with them. It quietly says, "This is who I am. I will always be this way. My past has already decided my future." These statements feel permanent, but they are not descriptions of reality. They are descriptions of identification. The unconscious has a remarkable ability to confuse experience with identity. A painful event becomes a permanent self-image. A difficult season becomes a lifelong definition. A single wound begins speaking as though it represents the whole person. And without noticing it, the individual stops carrying the story. The story begins carrying them. This is why awareness is so transformative. Not because it magically erases pain, not because it changes the past, but because it creates distance between the observer and the experience. The person begins to notice, "I have fear." Instead of, "I am fear." "I carry sadness." Instead of, "I am sadness." "I experienced rejection." Instead of, "I am unworthy." This small shift changes everything, because once experience is no longer confused with identity, the prison begins to dissolve. The walls were never made of concrete. They were made of unquestioned identification. The door was never opened from the outside. It was recognized from within. Freedom is not becoming a different person. It is remembering that beneath every fear, every defense, every hidden belief, there has always been an awareness untouched by them. The self that observes, the self that witnesses, the self that was never imprisoned, even while the mind believed it was. And perhaps this is the deepest psychological truth of all. The prison was never your true nature. It was only the place where your unconscious learned to survive. And the moment you see the prison for what it is, you also begin to see the door that was there all along.